With few exceptions, Shakespeare didn't really invent many of his plots or characters. By modern standards, it would actually be termed plagiarism, but at the time it was relatively common. One of the places he looked to for inspiration was Holinshed's Chronicles. Published in 1587, this was a comprehensive survey of British history, and Shakespeare looked to the period 1034 to 1057 in Scotland for his inspiration for Macbeth. He took all the main events and characters for the play from this book and just made a few changes. Some of the big ones were that because Duncan is killed in battle in open revolt by Macbeth in the source material, which Shakespeare felt lacked drama, he based the killing on the story of Donwald instead, whose wife incited him to rebel against the king, and they killed him in the same way in which Macbeth kills Duncan in the play. He also took from the story of King Kenneth, who murdered his nephew, the mysterious voice that reproaches him after the deed and threatens him. There are about 35 incidents in the play that aren't in Holinshed. They're not all equally significant, so we'll just go through some of the most important ones to help you understand what Shakespeare's overall aims were in cutting and polishing the rough diamond he found in Holinshed. The first one is that we begin the play with the witches planning to meet Macbeth. This is significant because it's the only Shakespeare play that begins with supernatural characters alone on stage. And the impact of that is that we can't say that they're just hallucinated by some human character on stage. This is the only play that begins with the supernatural objectively there. Perhaps this suggests something about its importance at the heart of the play. The next thing I think is very important is the fact that Duncan in the play just hears about the war. This is very different from the source material in which Duncan actually fought in the war. So in the source material, Duncan fights, but in the play, he just stands back, listens. In fact, he seems so remote that he can't even really recognize the captain who comes to give him a report. This makes him stand out quite a lot from other British monarchs in the Shakespeare canon. In fact, I think only Henry VI doesn't fight, apart from Duncan. Even King Lear, old as he is, goes into battle with Cordelia. So for a king not to fight might be significant dramatically because it heightens the contrast between Duncan and Macbeth. It creates what some people call the Achilles-Agamemnon problem. If you know the story of the Iliad, you'll know about that. Essentially, you've got a king who seems largely incompetent in warfare and needs the warrior general or the prowess of the military hero to defend him. And this can create a power imbalance so that the Achilles or the Macbeth figure feels that actually he should be the one who is in charge because he has the greater honor and the kingdom depends more on him than on the king, who is seen as incompetent or perhaps even cowardly. So Duncan is made into an older, perhaps holier figure, more virtuous, but there's a kind of weakness there that is highlighted by his refusal or inability to actually defend his own kingdom at the beginning. The next important bit is related to that, and it is the fact that Duncan calls Macbeth a peerless kinsman. That almost legitimizes Macbeth's claim to the throne, because under Scotland's traditional mode of succession, it would be the king's worthiest cousin who should succeed him. So that's what kinsman suggests. And then in any kingdom, the only man without peer really is a king. So the image of Macbeth as a peerless kinsman separates him from everybody else and makes it seem like he is uniquely important or uniquely honoured. In an elective monarchy, he is the one who should be chosen. So you can imagine that phrase almost confirming to Macbeth his own ideas about the legitimacy of his claim to the throne. So it escalates the tension between the two of them. The next important moment dramatically is the fact that Macbeth sends the letter to Lady Macbeth announcing to her what the witches have told him. Lady Macbeth, before Macbeth gets to see her face to face, is already being worked up, being excited by the prospect of her husband becoming the double thainship and then also king as well one day. So she is there before he actually arrives, thinking about things, plotting, getting ready. It also means that even though she's the first character in the play to appear alone, her words at the beginning aren't even her own. So her first words when she appears on stage are actually from Macbeth's letter. So it emphasises this idea of solitude on the one hand, because she appears alone, the first character to appear alone in the whole play, but also she's speaking her husband's words. So there's this strange combination of solitude, but also the bond between the two of them, as if she's living through him, which is perhaps why she's so keen on him pursuing. Is it even his ambition? Is it mainly hers? That's a big debate to be had about the two of them as a couple. Now, why does Macbeth's conscience forbid the murder of Duncan in the play, but not in the source material? Why is that dramatically important? Probably because it develops not just the conflict between Macbeth and Duncan, but between Macbeth and his conscience as well. So it means that he's not a pantomime villain who's just bad through and through. It means that he's a character with whom the audience, perhaps disturbingly, can at least partly sympathise, and it makes the whole tragedy more terrifying. And remember, Aristotle said that pity and fear are the two emotional responses people have to tragedy as a genre. Pity and fear, it perhaps makes it more terrifying that he knows exactly what he's doing and goes ahead with it anyway. So he's walking into it eyes open, fully aware of how he's going against his conscience. So there's kind of terrible clarity and certainty in his understanding of exactly what he's doing. Makes him a more interesting character, more tormented, more conflicted, that his conscience says, no, we shouldn't be doing this. Then the tension between him and his wife escalates because she overcomes his initial reservations and, in fact, taunts and goads him. So drama is all about conflict and tension. So now we're getting it between the married couple as well, which makes for exciting material on stage. You'll notice that Banquo can't sleep on the night of the murder, and he politely refuses being involved in this treasonous activity. Well, this is because in the source material, Banquo is actually a co-conspirator, and he goes along with Macbeth rather than against him. The trouble is, though, that King James I, watching the play, claimed descent from Banquo, and Shakespeare is being careful here not to present one of James's own ancestors as a regicide. So there's some element of pandering to the king here. It also, though, again makes it more exciting because Banquo, as Macbeth's co-captain, is now another figure who is in conflict with him. Remember, if in doubt, especially when answering on an extract, always look for where the conflict and tension is, because that's where drama lives, in conflict and in tension. The addition of the Drunken Porter is important because it gives us, on the one hand, some comic relief. He's quite funny. He talks about getting drunk. He talks about sex. He makes some rude jokes. He would have got a laugh at the time the play was performed first and still does nowadays. But he also, through the image of the castle as hell and himself as keeping the gate to it, starts to comment on some of the overarching themes of the play. In some medieval mystery plays, the Harrowing of Hell, the porter is a figure at the gates to hell. So that's what this is alluding to. He jokes about sinners taking the primrose way to hell. So it's easy to go there, but Macbeth does the opposite. He takes anything but the primrose way to hell. He seems certain that he's going there, and in fact, hell is the last word he says before he kills Duncan. Why does Macbeth murder Banquo? We mentioned the fact that in the source material they work together, And the fact that Macbeth becomes suspicious of Banquo and paranoid and feels that he will only be safe when Banquo is gone, because the witches prophesied that Banquo, although he wouldn't be king, would be father to kings. The importance of that is, again, tension between the two of them. So one of the things in the tragedy you should watch for is the movement from, broadly speaking, order to disorder. And that applies not just to the kingdom overall, but to Macbeth's marriage and his friendship with Banquo as well. And also his own state of mind, from sanity towards insanity at the end. The scene with the ghost at the banquet is entirely added by Shakespeare. Remember, when writing about drama, you have to think about what's on stage rather than just what is on the page. So you can see that visually, having the ghost present and only Macbeth being able to see him, but no other characters being able to, is a very dramatic moment. It sums up some of the themes about madness, paranoia, control, anxiety, blood, because the ghost is dripping with it, that have pervaded the play up until this point. Another interesting addition is that Macduff, when he hears about his family's massacre, seeks revenge. In the play version, Macduff is an avenger. Again, that builds some more tension, some more conflict, this time between Macbeth and Macduff. There's now a protagonist-antagonist pair. Another whole scene added is Lady Macbeth walking and talking in her sleep. Much like the banquet scene with the ghost, this is a moment where, even without using too many words, there's some action on stage that you see that sums up some of the main moments and moods of the action of the play. So it's a bit like in Hamlet with the skull. You've just got this one very powerful image which anybody in the audience can fully appreciate. So Shakespeare's writing for everybody, not just people who can translate some of his new words straight from the Latin and Greek and figure out what's going on at the deepest levels of the linguistic artistry. Why does Macbeth suffer mental torture to the end? Why does the murder have the impact on him that it does? This reminds us of his inner torment, the inner tension and conflict. And then right at the end, I think one of the best details is that he doesn't really want to kill Macduff, ultimately. My soul is too much charged with blood of thine already. So Macbeth, right at the end, even when you think he's at his most evil, says, no, enough. Your family's dead. That's enough of your blood. So it's very hard, even at the end, to say that he's just some sort of demon or butcher. There's an element of humanity left there. Remember, it's not melodrama. Right, reviewing the changes then, what we can see is that there are a couple that should strike us as really standing out from the rest. By making Duncan old and holy compared to what he is in the source material, it increases the audience sympathy for him. It makes Macbeth's murder of him seem more shocking, more terrible. It paints Macbeth in a much darker light. By making there be one big battle at the start, rather than, as there were in the source material, numerous smaller battles, Macbeth's actions are made to seem more heroic, more decisive. It's also interesting that what actually happened in the battles is that Macbeth's opponents either fled or killed themselves, whereas in the play, he defeats them in hand-to-hand, face-to-face combat, which is more honourable. This again makes him seem more heroic. In the source material, Macbeth only really starts to think about killing Duncan when he, as he shouldn't have done under an elective monarchy, decides just to nominate his son Malcolm as his successor. So that is what the Thanes had a problem with originally. But Macbeth starts to think about killing him before that. And Shakespeare downplays Duncan's breaking of the rules of how the new king should be chosen. So that is made to seem less important. It's in the background. So it seems that Macbeth has no legitimate grievance and is just driven purely by his own ambition. So we can see that theme being brought to the forefront. He fears the murder and suffers afterwards, as he doesn't in the source material, because it means Shakespeare then can explore that whole extra, perhaps most important element of inner torment and conflict. So this is a character who is in conflict with not only his king and his wife and his friend and co-captain Banquo, but also with himself. There's also Macduff to think about too, and we'll come to him later. There are no accomplices except his wife, which again darkens Macbeth. Banquo, remember, in the original was a co-conspirator. Here, though, Banquo is partly idealised because James I is watching. It would be too subversive to portray his ancestor as a regicide. His 10 years good rule is cut out, so it's made to seem more tyrannical. Macduff swears revenge, making him an antagonist character, which builds the structure of the play and also gets us thinking about the battle between good and evil. 3 whole scenes are added, which have enormous visual impact on the summing up of the main themes of the play. The ghost scene with Banquo at the banquet, the cauldron as well, when Macbeth visits the witches for the second time, and Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking. These are some of the most iconic images in the whole play. It begins with supernatural beings alone on stage. This makes them an objective feature of the Macbeth cosmos and puts them right at its heart. And another interesting fact, it's the only Shakespeare play with 2 doctors in it. Not just 1, but 2. Perhaps this is partly a play about sickness, physical, but also spiritual as well, moving beyond just individuals to entire kingdoms. So we can see from some of these alterations the kind of direction he wants to go in. Starting from the Holinshed source material, he then explores some of the different potentialities. A summary then of the kind of imaginative territory he seems to be setting out on and trying to explore is ideas about ambition, the power of conscience, the struggle between good and evil, as it exists not only between characters but within individual characters, and also this sense of psychomachia. This means war within the soul. Macbeth is a warrior against external forces, as we meet him at the beginning of the play. But what happens is that as the play progresses, the battlefield becomes perhaps even more so his own soul. And this is a battlefield where he doesn't feel quite as comfortable. Facing the threat posed by the witches, he's unable to resist. That's a foe that he doesn't know how to conquer. In the banquet scene, when Banquo's ghost appears, he wants it to appear as anything else, a rhinoceros, a tiger, something that he can attack physically. But this whole supernatural realm is something that unnerves him. He doesn't know how to deal with it. It's important to be aware of the conventions of the form of tragedy when writing about it for the exam, because AO2 demands that you are able to explore aspects of form. That goes alongside structure often. Structure is more like the specific patterns or images that work in this particular tragedy, whereas form is more like the rules that you have to play by when writing tragedies generally. The easiest way to think about it is that comedies, broadly speaking, start with disorder and move towards order, ending in a marriage. Tragedies, broadly speaking, start with order and move towards disorder, ending in death. So comedies nowadays we think of as being funny, tragedies as sad. That's not far off, but for Shakespeare's writing, rather than just happiness and sadness, think marriage and think death. Some people think that tragedy is more important than comedy and prefer the tragic plays to the comic ones. Tragedy deals with things that are going to happen, with the inevitable, whereas comedy deals with things that might not happen. There's a kind of profound truth in that. So you might not get married, you might not be happy, but you will die. So tragedy is about something on some level that is deeper existentially. At least that's the argument anyway. And this perhaps is why tragedy has its roots in ancient Greek drama, where there's no Christian hope of the resurrection and everything being okay in the end. So on many views of the way the world is, tragedy is actually more in line with the truth. It's like no matter how good the first 4 acts of the play might be, the 5th one is always going to be bloody. And that might be true of individual lives, whole civilizations as well. So tragedy has this kind of intuitive, deep appeal to it, dealing as it does with inevitability, whereas comedy is about evitability, what might not happen, even though we might obviously prefer there to be a comic resolution. So there are three different strands to think about when exploring these movements towards order or disorder. In comedy, the first one, the social drive towards order, is that around the marriage the play concludes with, a new social group crystallizes. There's a kind of harmony or integration. The next strand is just looking at like dual identity. So two lovers move towards marriage. And then for the individual character's psyche, they might come to understand themselves in a new way, or integrate or harmonize different aspects of their personality. In tragedy, we look at the opposite. So socially, it's going to be about the fall of a kingdom. We deal with one particular figure, the prince or the king, and his downfall brings about war or strife or the ruin of the kingdom. You might have heard the phrase, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. And that is why traditionally tragedies are about people of noble rank. Arguably as well, it's why the devil in Christianity is the supreme tragic figure, because created as the brightest of all the angels, Lucifer, meaning light bringer, he has the furthest to fall out of everybody. So there are kind of biblical analogues to these literary structures as well. If you took an amoeba, for example, how bad can an amoeba's day really be? Not that bad. So there's not much tragic potential there. But if you go to an animal, like polar bears, for example, go insane in zoos, there's a bit more potential for disorder there because you're starting from a greater point of order. Human beings, it gets even worse. And then if we're thinking about how we can have the most impact from the downfall of somebody, then a king, a prince, or military general, when things go badly for him, go badly for quite a lot of people who depend on him as well. The second strand, thinking about the dual aspect of the tendency towards disorder, you're thinking about marriages and lovers disintegrating, coming apart, tension. Lady Macbeth and Macbeth. Things get worse for them over the course of the whole play. There might also be tensions between them and the society around them. They become increasingly withdrawn, cut off from their social demands and duties. And then individually, in Macbeth's own mind, we're watching him slip towards disorder and insanity too. He complains that his mind is full of scorpions. So, his line, "To know my deed, 'twere best not know myself," when he's thinking about the killing of Duncan, shows that it's been very disruptive to his sense of self. He almost can't recognize himself as having done it. These are ideas, a summary of some of the important concepts in Northrop Frye's book, Fools of Time, which would be a good one to read to get an overview of some of the larger structures and patterns in Shakespearean tragedy. Remember that the disorder and order aren't total. If you started from a position of total order, how would the disorder ever get going? So there are already seeds of disorder right at the beginning, thinking about the strife and civil war at the beginning of Macbeth, for example. In comedy, likewise, if the disorder were total, then there would be no seeds of order to grow. And at the end as well, sometimes it's very dangerous for Shakespeare to finish a tragedy in total disorder because it would be quite politically subversive. So that at the end of Macbeth, for example, good ultimately does triumph, even though the body count is very high. So there is a sense in which the future looks bright. These are just broad brushstrokes. When you look at any extract or when you're planning a whole character response or a whole theme response essay, it's always a good idea to start from conflict. So think about the senses in which the character or characters are internally conflicted, how they're socially conflicted, whether there's a particular antagonist character, and also think about how they're in conflict with impersonal forces like fate, chance, nature, or the supernatural.